Power is never the loudest voice in the room. It is the quiet hand that built the door. At 8:43 p.m., snow moved like white ash against the 57th floor windows of Ainsley Meridian Tower, where the lights of Chicago glittered below Michigan Avenue in ribbons of gold. The conference room smelled of rain-soaked wool, polished walnut, and the faint metallic chill of an overworked heating system. Dr. Imani Cross stood near the glass wall in a deep burgundy dress, her posture still, her eyes reflecting the city like she had already measured every tower beneath her. She said nothing. Conrad Ainsley entered 3 minutes late in a charcoal Brioni suit that cost more than Imani's mother had earned in 6 months cleaning offices on the South Side. His Patek Philippe caught the ceiling light before he spoke. Beside him, Bianca Eloin floated in champagne silk, smiling as if the room, the weather, and the entire skyline had been arranged to admire her. Conrad smirked. The board had gathered for what the calendar called a private asset review meeting, but everyone understood that Conrad preferred meetings with witnesses when he wanted someone diminished gracefully. 2 senior partners from Hallberg and Rowe sat at the far end with sealed folders, while the CFO kept touching the corner of a $2.7 billion capital allocation report as though paper could become a shield. Outside, traffic crawled along Wacker Drive, red brake lights bleeding through the snow like warnings no one wanted to read. Conrad spoke first. "I bought her your jet." The sentence landed softly, almost politely, which made it colder. Bianca lowered her lashes and touched the slim gold bracelet on her wrist, enjoying the silence the way borrowed power enjoys borrowed applause. Conrad looked at Imani as if expecting a crack in her face, some public proof that she was still human enough to be humiliated. Imani only blinked. Years earlier, before the Forbes covers and Aspen panels and charity photographs, she had written the operating architecture that kept Ainsley Meridian alive. The aircraft compliance code, the treasury controls, the IP escrow triggers, the indemnity clauses buried beneath Conrad's favorite talking points. She had built the family office from a borrowed desk at 219 South Dearborn Street, then structured the aviation subsidiary through a Delaware holding company, a Nevada risk vehicle, and a London reinsurance layer that Conrad had never bothered to understand. To him, she had become decoration after usefulness, a wife to appear beside him at foundation breakfasts and disappear before the executives discussed power. That was his mistake. The jet in question was a Gulfstream G700 valued at $78 million, pearl white with graphite trim, photographed last week beside Bianca's cream luggage for a lifestyle magazine that Conrad's PR team had quietly paid to flatter them. Its tail number had appeared in the draft caption, then vanished after someone in communications noticed Imani's initials embedded in the aircraft management trust. Conrad believed removing a caption was the same as removing ownership. He was wrong. Across the table, attorney Miriam Voss placed 110 envelope on the marble surface with 2 fingers, neat and unhurried. The sound was small, but every person in the room heard it. Snow struck the glass harder, and for a moment the city lights below trembled behind the storm. Miriam's gray suit was plain, her voice even, her expression almost kind in the way surgeons look before explaining damage that already exists. The operating authority has been suspended. Conrad's smile thinned by 1 invisible inch. Bianca looked from Miriam to Conrad, still waiting for the room to return to the version where champagne silk was enough to matter. Imani turned from the window at last, calm as a signed clause, and the cold city light drew a clean line across her cheek. "Noise is not power," she said. The CFO stopped touching the report. Miriam opened the envelope and slid forward a notice of insurance freeze, a fiduciary control memorandum, and an IP escrow confirmation tied to the aircraft dispatch system Conrad had once called "my wife's little software project." The fleet had not been punished by emotion, jealousy, or spectacle. It had been grounded by beneficial ownership, risk governance, and the quiet consequence of violating the permissions that kept luxury in the air. Imani looked at Conrad, not as a wounded wife, but as the architect watching a careless tenant lose the keys to a building he never owned. Permission has limits. At 8:51 p.m., the room seemed to divide itself without anyone moving. On one side, Conrad wore a careless smile beneath the warm recessed lights, his Brioni shoulders polished by gold. In the darker corner near the glass, Imani stood silent, framed by snow, steel, and the blue-white glow of Chicago 57 stories below. The split was almost cinematic, wealth smiling under recessed gold light, while dignity waited where the city looked coldest. Bianca adjusted the champagne silk at her wrist and leaned toward Conrad, as if his confidence still had market value. Imani did not move. Conrad tapped 2 fingers on the marble table, trying to turn Miriam's words into a misunderstanding, because men like him preferred crisis only when it could be renamed as optics. He glanced at the CFO, then at the general counsel, then at the city lights along Wacker Drive, where red taillights pulsed through freezing rain like a slow audit. "Fix it," he said, soft enough to sound executive. No one answered. Miriam opened a second envelope, thinner than the first, and placed 3 pages in front of him: an aviation risk covenant, a cross-default notice, and a beneficial control addendum signed 6 years earlier during a refinancing round Conrad had used for a magazine profile about visionary leadership. These were not improvised measures. They were pre-authorized emergency instruments waiting for the exact breach Conrad had just created. The paper carried the pale scent of toner and expensive linen stock, the kind used by firms that charged $1,200 an hour to make consequences look clean. The headline was not dramatic, but the numbers were: 12 aircraft, for hangars under separate operating leases, for $130 million in insured assets, and 1 dispatch platform tied to Imani's original IP escrow. Conrad's careless smile faded. Across the room, the storm pressed harder against the windows, and the city turned into a grid of blurred amber light beneath the snow. Bianca's smile faded by degrees, not from shame, but from the slow realization that the private world she had entered was operated by rules she could not charm. She looked at the Cartier bracelet Conrad had given her that afternoon, then at the envelope, then at Imani's still hands. The only sound was the cold click of the titanium fleet access card as Miriam pressed it into the deactivation device and laid the disabled card beside the notice. Conrad's jaw tightened, but he kept his chin high because cameras had trained him to perform control even when control had already left the room. He asked whether the board understood the reputational impact of grounding aircraft during acquisition season, as if reputation were a fireproof wall and not wallpaper over debt. Miriam's answer stayed calm enough to make the question feel smaller. The board understands fiduciary exposure. Imani watched him from the dark glass, and the reflection placed her behind him like a signature he had forgotten was still binding. She remembered the first winter of Ainsley Meridian, when payroll had barely cleared by 4 p.m. On a Friday, and Conrad had promised the world that confidence alone could carry a company through a cash crunch. It had been Imani who built the Treasury waterfall, negotiated the side letter protections, wrote the risk model, and gave his empire a spine before it had a public face. Conrad had taken the applause. Now the same architecture was taking inventory. Miriam slid forward the final page, an emergency consent form authorizing a temporary fleet operations hold under insurance reserve protocols and IP governance breach provisions. The Mont Blanc pen rolled half an inch across the marble before stopping against Conrad's untouched water glass. Outside, a line of headlights crossed the Chicago River Bridge and disappeared into snow. "Sign, or the trustees sign for you." Bianca stepped back from Conrad. Only 10 inches, but in that room 10 inches looked like exile. Conrad stared at the page as if paper had betrayed him, when the truth was simpler and colder. Paper had remembered what people ignored. Imani finally stepped out of the corner, her burgundy dress catching one narrow blade of city light. She was not asking for the jet back. She was showing him that the sky had never belonged to him. At 8:58 p.m., the storm thickened until the windows of Ainsley Meridian Tower looked less like glass and more like black water, holding the city inside it. Under the warm ceiling lights, Conrad tried to recover his charm, one polished hand resting beside the Mont Blanc pen, his cufflinks bright, his smile arranged for invisible cameras. In the darker corner near the window, Imani remained still, burgundy against shadow, her face calm while snow erased the top floors across Michigan Avenue one by one. The room began to divide. The distance between Conrad and Imani was only 22 feet across a marble conference table, but it felt like 2 economies separated by silence. one built on applause, the other built on enforceable control. Bianca stood near Conrad's right shoulder in champagne silk, her perfume sweet and expensive against the dry heat of the room, her eyes moving from the disabled titanium access card to the unsigned consent form. The CFO's tablet showed 12 aircraft marked inactive in red, with projected losses of $6 million for the first 48 hours, and a pending acquisition dinner already collapsing in New York. Conrad inhaled through his nose. He told Miriam Voss that aircraft could not simply be grounded because one lawyer disliked a headline, but his voice had lost the smooth television rhythm that made donors lean forward at charity luncheons. Miriam did not look offended, because truth did not require her mood. She turned one page and revealed the clause Conrad had approved during the 2019 restructuring. Any unauthorized reassignment of a trust-managed aviation asset triggered automatic insurance reserve review, beneficial ownership verification, and IP escrow lockdown across the dispatch network. The only sound was the dry scrape of Miriam's fingernail under the embossed seal as the clause lifted from the paper like a sentence waking up. Conrad's face held steady under the lights, but the corner of his mouth betrayed him by half a second. Imani, still in the shadowed glass, watched him the way an architect watches someone push against a load-bearing wall. She remembered him dismissing those clauses as legal furniture when she brought them home after midnight, back when their apartment on East 53rd Street smelled of burnt coffee, printer heat, and unpaid ambition. You signed it. Conrad glanced down at the signature, and the room felt the temperature drop even though the thermostat still read 71 degrees. The signature was his, blue ink, confident and careless, written above a paragraph that made every aircraft subordinate to governance he had never respected. Bianca stepped closer to the table, then stopped when the general counsel placed a palm over the page, not roughly, but with the reflex of someone protecting evidence from performance. No one spoke. Outside, a gust of snow hid the river for 3 seconds, and when the lights came back through the weather, Chicago looked colder than before. Conrad tried a different weapon, softer and more public, saying Imani would not want the press to learn that her own decision had stranded executives, donors, and board allies across 3 states. He looked at her as if reputation had always been a leash. Imani turned from the window. Her heels made 2 quiet sounds on the stone floor, each one measured, each one final, until she stood beneath the edge of the light without entering its warmth. You confused silence with permission. Miriam placed a third document beside the consent form, a fiduciary breach memorandum addressed to the trustees of Cross Meridian Holdings, timed at 8:55 p.m., filed electronically through a secure Delaware portal, and copied to the aviation insurer in London. The numbers were plain enough for even Conrad's pride to understand. For $130 million in fleet assets, $91 million in annual operating exposure, 27 crew contracts, and 1 software license controlled by Imani's original IP trust. The Montblanc pen clicked once as Miriam opened it and set it before him. The only sound was the black ink crossing the consent line while Conrad signed away emergency operating discretion he thought had belonged to him. Bianca looked at the signature, then at the bracelet on her wrist, and for the first time that evening the silk around her seemed less like luxury and more like borrowed packaging. Conrad pushed the paper back as if distance could undo it. Imani did not smile, because this had never been theater to her. Revenge was loud. Accountability arrived notarized. At 9:07 p.m., Conrad tried to recover the room with a showroom smile beneath the recessed gold lights. One hand open on the marble, as if the signed consent form were only a temporary inconvenience. In the darker corner near the storm-black glass, Imani stood silent, her burgundy dress almost swallowed by shadow, her face lit only by the blue flicker of downtown Chicago through the snow. The split between them looked cruelly precise, Conrad in warmth, smiling for a power he no longer held, and Imani in the cold edge of the room, still enough to make silence feel like jurisdiction. The room watched both screens at once. Miriam Voss checked the timestamp on her phone, 9:08 p.m., then placed it face-up beside the disabled titanium fleet card and the wet ring Conrad's untouched water glass had left on the table. A new message arrived from the London insurer, short, formal, and impossible to flatter. Aviation Reserve Review confirmed, Fleet operations hold effective immediately. All dispatch credentials suspended pending beneficial ownership verification. The CFO read the notice twice, his thumb hovering over the tablet as 12 aircraft icons turned from amber to gray, one after another, like lights going out along a private sky. Conrad stopped smiling. Bianca took half a step backward, her champagne silk catching the light beautifully, while her expression failed to understand why beauty had no voting rights in a governance crisis. Outside, snow hit the windows in hard silver lines, and the towers across Michigan Avenue blurred into electric ghosts above the river. The room smelled of cold glass, expensive ink, and Bianca's vanilla perfume fading beneath the sharper scent of fear-controlled professionalism. Miriam spoke softly. The insurer has acknowledged the hold. Conrad looked at Imani then, not with apology, but with calculation, as if he were still searching for the emotional lever that had once worked on people beneath him. He reminded the room that Ainsley Meridian had a $1.8 billion infrastructure bid closing at 10 a.m., that 3 board members were scheduled to appear in Dallas before noon, and that grounding the fleet could trigger reputational drag across lenders, donors, and acquisition partners. His voice rose only slightly, polished enough for a CNBC panel, but the veneer had thinned until everyone could see the machinery beneath it. Imani looked at the snow. The truth was that she had anticipated this exact argument years earlier, when Conrad confused speed with control and charisma with governance. She had built a liquidity firewall, a key person risk clause, and a discretionary asset lock provision after one winter night in 2020 when he used corporate aircraft for a private favor and called her caution small-minded. The clause had sat quietly inside a family office operating agreement reviewed by 3 firms, ignored by the man who signed it, and preserved by the woman who understood him. Paper weighted better than people. Miriam removed a narrow ivory seal from her folder, aligned it over the emergency trustee certification, and pressed down with calm finality. The only sound was the heavy click of the notary embosser biting into the certification page. Conrad's eyes dropped to the raised seal, because embossed paper had a way of making denial look childish. Bianca touched her bracelet again, and the Cartier gold seemed suddenly lighter, less like proof of arrival, and more like a receipt from a man spending authority on credit. The general counsel cleared his throat and confirmed that under Delaware fiduciary standards, the trustees could not release the hold without Imani's written consent or a full risk committee vote. No one moved. Across the table, Conrad's reflection appeared beside Imani's in the black window, his face bright under the lights, hers dark and composed behind him, the city between them like a verdict. He asked what she wanted, and the question sounded smaller than the empire that carried his name. Imani turned from the glass slowly, feeling the dry warmth of the room against her skin and the cold memory of snow beyond it. Accuracy, she said. Miriam slid one final memorandum forward, detailing the aircraft trust, the IP escrow, the insurance reserve, and the beneficial control structure Conrad had advertised as his own genius for 7 public years. The figure at the bottom was not a threat. It was accounting. For $130 million in fleet exposure, $72 million in restricted operating liquidity, and one wife whose silence had been mistaken for absence. Conrad stared at the numbers. Imani did not need to raise her voice, because every clause in the room had already spoken for her. At 9:16 p.m., Conrad kept a practiced smile beneath the warm recessed lights, but it no longer reached his eyes. It looked like confidence placed carefully over a collapsing balance sheet. In the darker corner near the snow-streaked glass, Imani stood silent, her reflection layered over the Chicago skyline like a quiet lean against everything he had called his own. The room held them in split screen, Conrad bright under gold light, performing confidence for directors and counsel, while Imani remained in shadow, still enough to make his performance look expensive and thin. Everyone saw the difference. Miriam Voss adjusted the emergency trustee certification and turned her phone so the board could see the incoming confirmation from the insurer's New York risk desk, timestamped 9:17 p.m., with the subject line reduced to 5 cold words. Operations hold acknowledged and active. The CFO's tablet refreshed again, showing aircraft in Teterboro, Dallas, Scottsdale, and Palm Beach locked from dispatch authorization, each one tagged with reserve review status and pending beneficial control clearance. Outside the tower, freezing rain threaded through the snow and turned the lights along Lake Shore Drive into trembling gold needles. Conrad kept the expression in place. He asked whether anyone in the room had considered the optics of grounding a billionaire's fleet over a domestic misunderstanding, and the phrase domestic misunderstanding made Bianca glance down, as if even she heard the emptiness inside it. Imani's hands remained relaxed at her sides. No tremor, no gesture, no appeal for sympathy from people who had once praised her intelligence only when it served Conrad's narrative. The room smelled of leather chairs, winter static, and legal paper warmed under ceiling lights. Miriam answered first. "This is not domestic." Conrad looked at her. Miriam slid forward the board packet marked Risk Committee Review, and the top page listed fiduciary duty, asset misuse, unauthorized benefit transfer, reputational exposure, and insurance reserve impairment in language so clean it felt almost merciful. The amount beside the unauthorized benefit analysis was $78,400,000, with supplemental exposure estimated at $31,600,000 if creditor covenants were deemed breached before midnight. Bianca's bracelet clicked softly against the table edge as she shifted her weight, and the small bright sound made her flinch because it reminded everyone that her luxury had entered the room as evidence. The only sound was the soft click of the Cartier gift box lid as Miriam closed it over the bracelet and placed it beside the fiduciary memorandum. Conrad's face changed by one controlled fraction, not enough for a camera, but enough for Imani. He turned toward the independent director from Boston, a woman named Helen Price who had flown in for the infrastructure vote and had once called Imani the best risk mind in the company after a closed-door audit in 2021. Helen did not rescue him. She removed her reading glasses and asked whether the aircraft trust had been disclosed accurately in the last board materials. Conrad did not answer quickly enough. The snow outside thickened until the building across the river disappeared behind a white curtain, leaving only reflected ceiling lights floating in the black window. Imani remembered being 26, standing outside a bank on LaSalle Street with wet shoes, carrying a binder of models no one wanted to credit to her until Conrad learned how to repeat her language with better tailoring. She had made him legible to lenders, safe to insurers, glamorous to donors, and inevitable to magazines. He had mistaken translation for ownership. Miriam opened a smaller folder, cream-colored, unbranded, and placed a shareholder consent notice in front of Helen Price, then another in front of the CFO, then the original before Imani. The voting block was not loud, but it was precise. Cross Meridian Holdings, 2 institutional trustees, 1 pension-backed strategic fund, and a protective covenant that converted emergency asset misuse into temporary governance transfer. Conrad stared at the percentages: 41, 8% direct influence, 12, 4% protective proxy, and enough consent rights to freeze any aviation-related capital movement above $5 million. He understood the math too late. Miriam uncapped the pen and offered it to Imani, not Conrad. The only sound was Imani's signature moving across the consent notice, smooth black ink turning silence into corporate action. Bianca looked at Conrad then, searching for the man who had promised her a sky with no invoices attached. Under the lights, he looked smaller. In the dark glass, Imani looked exactly the same. "Proceed," she said. And for the first time that night, the room obeyed her before it looked at him. At 9:24 p.m., Conrad let a thin, polished smile remain beneath the gold-recessed lights, as if the room had misheard the word proceed, his hands spreading over the marble in a gesture he had used at investor summits from Manhattan to Palo Alto. In the darker corner by the stormlit glass, Imani stood silent, her burgundy dress nearly black against the reflection of Chicago's frozen skyline, her eyes steady while snow erased the rooftops beyond Michigan Avenue. The split screen was unforgiving, the husband glowing under warmth, performing command with a smile, while the wife stayed in shadow, still as a clause waiting to be enforced. The board watched the shadow. Helen Price opened the shareholder consent notice and read the first line twice, her Boston accent clipped by concern and expensive schooling. The CFO pulled up the capital table on his tablet, and the numbers reflected in his glasses: $5 million approval threshold, $72 million restricted liquidity, for $130 million fleet exposure, and a temporary governance transfer triggered under emergency asset misuse provisions. Bianca stood beside Conrad in champagne silk, beautiful beneath the lights, but her beauty had become irrelevant data in a room ruled by fiduciary language. She touched nothing. Miriam Voss placed a small silver corporate seal beside Imani's signed consent, then aligned the pages into a perfect stack with the care of someone closing a door without raising her voice. She explained that Cross Meridian Holdings had not seized anything. It had activated protective control under the very covenants Conrad had praised as institutional-grade discipline during the 2022 bond roadshow. Outside, freezing rain tapped the glass with a dry, needled sound, and Lakeshore Drive glowed far below like a gold wire pulled through black ice. Conrad's smile weakened. He said the transfer would make him look compromised before lenders, and Miriam answered that the lenders had already been notified under pre-default disclosure protocol. He said the press would twist it, and Helen replied that the communications committee would describe it as an internal risk governance action. He said the board owed him loyalty. Imani looked at him. For 12 years, she had given him the kind of loyalty that built structures before cameras arrived. Fund architecture, source code custody, insurance reserve modeling, Delaware trust controls, and lender comfort letters no magazine ever photographed. For 12 years, he had turned her precision into his mythology, her restraint into his convenience, and her absence from the spotlight into proof that she belonged behind him. Now the architecture was visible. Miriam lifted Conrad's backup executive aviation authorization card and placed it beneath the security cutter. The only sound was the clean punch of the security cutter as it pierced Conrad's backup aviation access card, leaving a perfect oval hole through the silver laminate. Bianca inhaled, not dramatically, but sharply enough that the general counsel looked up. Conrad stared at the ruined card as if it were a portrait of himself made too honestly. The CFO's tablet refreshed at 9:27 p.m., showing governance authority reassigned to interim trustee oversight with Imani as required consent holder for aviation, IP, and capital movement. No one clapped. No one needed to. Snow thickened beyond the glass, and the city lights below flickered through the weather like witnesses refusing to leave. Conrad turned toward Imani and lowered his voice, asking whether she was truly willing to embarrass him over one aircraft and one careless comment. Imani stepped from the dark edge into the narrow blade of light, calm, elegant, unreachable. It was never one aircraft, she said. Miriam handed Helen the final board resolution, already tabbed for signature, and the pen moved from director to director with quiet, professional inevitability. The only sound was paper accepting ink while Conrad's empire learned whose permission had kept it airborne. At 9:33 p.m., Conrad forced one final smile beneath the gold-recessed lights, but the expression had become thin, a public relations reflex searching for an audience that no longer trusted the script. In the darker corner by the storm-polished glass, Imani stood silent, her burgundy dress catching only a narrow blue reflection from Chicago's frozen skyline, her face calm while the city lights trembled below Michigan Avenue. The room held them in split screen again, Conrad bright and performative under warmth, smiling as if status could reverse paperwork, while Imani remained in shadow, quiet as the legal structure that had just moved around him. The performance did not survive. Helen Price signed the board resolution at 9:34 p.m., then passed it to the CFO, whose hand paused over the signature line as a notification from the London insurer appeared beside the frozen fleet dashboard. 12 aircraft remained grounded, 27 crew contracts shifted into standby protection, and a $91 million reserve account moved from discretionary spending into restricted control under trustee oversight. Outside, snow scraped the windows in white diagonal lines, and the lights along the Chicago River looked like coins sinking under black ice. Miriam Voss watched the CFO sign. The pen looked ordinary, but its movement changed everything Conrad had tried to keep theatrical into something enforceable, filed, and measured. Bianca stood a careful foot behind him now, no longer touching his sleeve, her champagne silk bright under the lights, while her confidence folded into silence. The only sound was the hard click of Miriam's cancellation stamp as it marked the expired aircraft gift letter before she laid it beside the punched backup access card. Conrad stared at the canceled letter because it had carried the phrase he liked most, personal transfer of use. Miriam explained that personal use had no force against beneficial ownership, insurance covenants, IP escrow restrictions, or a family office governance lock triggered by unauthorized asset reassignment. The General Counsel added that the attempted gift created a potential related party benefit requiring disclosure before the 10 a.m. infrastructure bid call. The CFO whispered that the lender comfort letters would need amendment by midnight. Then amend them, Imani said. Conrad turned on her with controlled softness, the kind he used in interviews when he wanted discipline to look like charm. He reminded her that Ainsley Meridian carried his name, that the donors knew his face, that the magazines had built a decade of narrative around his instinct, his vision, his appetite for impossible deals. He stood under the lights as if they belonged to him, while she remained near the dark glass, still and unblinking, the snow behind her making the city look distant and judicial. Imani listened. She remembered building the debt service model that saved his first acquisition, remembered coding the dispatch compliance layer at 2:18 a.m. While he rehearsed a speech about courage, remembered signing away credit because loyalty had once felt noble. She had not been erased by accident. She had been made invisible because invisibility was useful to him. Miriam placed a trusty communication memo in front of Conrad, timestamped 9:39 p.m., addressed to lenders, insurers, directors, and outside counsel. It named Dr. Imani Cross as required consent holder for aviation operations, IP licensing continuity, capital movement above $5 million, and emergency reputational risk disclosures. It did not insult him. It replaced him. The only sound was the corporate seal pressing into the lender notice, turning soft paper into a raised mark no apology could flatten. Bianca looked at the canceled gift letter, then at Conrad, and her eyes finally understood that borrowed luxury had no equity. The city lights blinked below them through the snow, cold, patient, and indifferent to embarrassment. Conrad's voice lowered. He asked if she wanted him ruined. Imani stepped fully into the light, not angry, not wounded, not triumphant, only precise. I wanted you accurate. At 9:46 p.m., Conrad stood beneath the gold-recessed lights and released a small, practiced breath that tried to pass for amusement, the kind men use when they are trying to convince a room that humiliation is only a scheduling problem. In the darker corner, near the snow-blurred glass, Imani stood silent, her burgundy dress still as the city lights below flickered through the storm like distant filings in a courthouse vault. The split screen had become undeniable. Conrad under warmth, smiling at a room that had stopped believing him, while Imani remained in shadow, calm enough to make power look quiet and inherited fear look loud. Then his phone began to vibrate. The screen lit across the marble with 5 missed calls from Ainsley Meridian Communications, 2 from the Dallas infrastructure team, and 1 from a lender at Bexley Capital Partners, marked urgent in all capital letters. The CFO's tablet updated at 9:47 p.m. Showing restricted liquidity locked at $72 million, fleet utilization frozen at 0, and acquisition-related travel rerouted to commercial charters pending trustee consent. Outside, wind pushed snow against the windows so hard the city disappeared in sections. First the river, then the bridge, then the bronze lights along Wacker Drive. Miriam Voss did not hurry. She placed a communications hold memo beside the trustee notice, and its language was almost elegant in its restraint. No public statement without risk committee approval, no asset characterization without beneficial ownership review, no reference to spousal disagreement in investor materials. Conrad stared at the sentence banning the phrase he had planned to use. Bianca read it over his shoulder, her champagne silk bright beneath the ceiling lights, but her face had lost the soft arrogance that had carried her into the room. She finally understood that being photographed near a jet was not the same as owning access to the sky. "This is excessive," Conrad said. Helen Price closed her folder, and the gesture sounded louder than his objection. Miriam opened a small evidence sleeve and removed the glossy magazine proof Conrad's PR team had arranged, the one showing Bianca beside the pearl-white Gulfstream with cream luggage, diamond earrings, and a caption calling it a personal gift from Conrad Ainsley. The page smelled faintly of ink and luxury advertising, all polished surfaces and borrowed authority. Imani looked at it once, without anger. The only sound was the firm press of Miriam's red cancellation stamp over the glossy caption, marking the words void before she placed the proof beside the fiduciary breach memo. Conrad's practiced amusement vanished completely. His name was still on the tower, still on the annual report, still on the foundation wall downstairs in brushed steel letters 8 inches high. But inside the room that mattered, the enforceable names were different: Cross Meridian Holdings, Trustee Consent, IP Escrow, Reserve Impairment, Beneficial Control Verification. Branding had met governance. Bianca stepped away from him by another foot, and the distance was small enough to measure, but large enough to confess. She whispered that she had not known, and the words fell softly, uselessly, onto marble that had already heard numbers more important than innocence. Conrad turned toward Imani as if she owed him protection from the consequences of being understood. Imani did not move. Snow darkened the glass behind her, and the city lights caught in her eyes with a cold precision that reminded Miriam of signed covenants and sealed archives. At 9:52 p.m., the lender's reply arrived, confirming that all aviation-related representations would be amended before midnight and that no further capital movement above $5 million would proceed without Imani's consent. The board read it in silence. Miriam slid the final page toward Imani, a statement of corrective authority for internal governance disclosure. The only sound was the soft drag of Imani's pen across the signature line, black ink making visible what Conrad had spent years keeping invisible. When she finished, she capped the pen and left it on the table. "Correction is not cruelty," she said. Conrad stood beneath the warm lights, no longer laughing, while Imani remained calm at the edge of darkness, and outside the 57th floor windows, Chicago disappeared into snow as if the entire city had chosen not to witness his performance anymore. At 10:03 p.m., the last signature was completed, and the conference room at Ainsley Meridian Tower became quieter than any victory should have been. Conrad stood beneath the warm gold lights with the remains of his public smile still arranged on his face, while Imani stood near the darker glass, silent against the storm, her burgundy dress reflected over Chicago's frozen skyline like a seal placed over a closed file. The split screen held until the end, the husband bright under expensive lighting, surrounded by marble, council, and a name on the building, while the wife remained in shadow, calm enough to prove that ownership had never needed applause. No one mistook the image again. Miriam Voss gathered the signed board resolution, the trustee communication memo, the corrected lender disclosure, and the governance transfer notice into one precise stack at 10:05 p.m. The CFO confirmed that the $72 million liquidity reserve would remain restricted. The $430 million fleet would stay grounded pending risk committee review, and all aviation, IP, and capital approvals above $5 million would require Dr. Imani Cross's consent. Outside, snow fell so densely that the lights along Wacker Drive looked like candles trapped under ice. The empire had not collapsed. That was the point. Conrad was still rich, still dressed in Brioni, still wearing a Patek Philippe, still standing in a tower with his name carved into the lobby in brushed steel. But every meaningful system around him now required permission from the woman he had treated like expired ornamentation. His wealth remained, cold and polished, but without Imani's mind behind it. It felt like a palace after the power had gone out. Bianca Aloan had already stepped toward the door, one hand around her Cartier bracelet, her champagne silk whispering against the carpet with the soft sound of borrowed luxury, leaving before the invoice arrived. She did not look at the canceled aircraft gift letter again. She did not ask about the Gulfstream. She understood, finally, that a man could buy attention with money, but not authority with another woman's architecture. The only sound was the closing click of the Cartier box as Miriam placed it into the evidence sleeve beside the voided magazine proof and the punched backup access card. Conrad watched it disappear. He wanted to blame the board, the trustees, the insurer, the lawyers, the weather, the timing, the optics, the woman beside him, the woman leaving him, anyone except the hollow place where his own judgment should have been. But the room had already shown him the truth in numbers, covenants, signatures, and silence. Without Imani's intelligence, he was not the empire's architect. He was its photograph. At 10:11 p.m., Helen Price and the CFO left first, followed by General Counsel, then Miriam, who paused only long enough to hand Imani the final certified copy. Conrad remained by the table, wealthy beyond most people's imagination, alone beyond anything money could explain. The storm softened against the glass, and Chicago's lights returned in fragments beneath the snow. Imani walked past him without anger. He whispered her name once, not as a command, but as a late discovery. She stopped at the door, turned just enough for the city light to touch her cheek, and gave him the only ending he had earned. This is consequence. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.